Chapter 57, Transportation, Section 6, The adventurous habits of a hunting life favoured by the early necessities of the settlement trained the prisoners to bush ranging. The lawless pioneers of the settlers repeated in Tasmania the exploits once common in Great Britain when the merry green wood was the retreat of the outlaw, and always found where the population is scanty and the government feeble. The popular names of places denote the character or tastes of their early visitors and heroes. The bushrangers at first were absentees, who were soon allured or driven to theft and violence. But so early as 1808, Lemon and Brown, by systematic robbery, had excited feelings of alarm. One of these men was surprised asleep and decapitated at Lemon Springs, which bear his name. The severity of corporal punishment, which prevailed at that period, when no prison more secure than a stockade had been built, induced the accused to obtain a respite by retiring to the bush. Some men of milder disposition abstained from all active violations of the law and kept aloof from offenders of a different temper. Of a sailor who deserted to the forest, it is said that he not only refrained from robberies, but often prevented them. He had carried to his retreat a young woman whom he professed to love, and remained for 3 years in his seclusion. The romance of this event was, however, extinguished at the close of their exile. The man grew prosperous, abandoned his faithful companion, and married another. Towards the close of 1813, the daring and sanguinary violence of bushrangers reduced the colony to the utmost distress. The settlers, generally of the lowest class, received their plunder and gave them notice of pursuit. Their alliance with stockkeepers, who themselves passed rapidly and almost naturally from the margin of civilized to a lawless life, was well understood. Nor could they readily refuse their friendship. The government, unable to afford them protection, left them no other source of safety. The division of the colonists into those who had been convicts and those who controlled them naturally ranged all of loose principles on the side of the outlaws. Nor was their mode of life without attractions. They were free. Their daring seemed like heroism to those in bondage. They not unfrequently professed to punish severity to the prisoners, and like Robin Hood of old, to pillage the rich that they might be generous to the poor. The course adopted by the government indicated the strength of the robbers. Despairing to reduce them by force, in 1814 Macquarie tendered pardon, except for the crime of murder, to those who within 6 months should return to their duty. To give effect to this treaty, time was judged necessary for its publication, and to allow for the hesitation of the penitent, a distant day was appointed for closing the door. This singular document was prepared by His Majesty's judge, who was thus himself bound in honour to its unexampled conditions. But the legal acumen of the robbers soon detected the error. Its effect was not only pardon for the past, but with the exception of murder, a license to ravage the colony until the date expired. Thus they gathered the harvest of crime and continued their depredations to the last. Nor was another advantage foreseen, although eagerly embraced by the robbers. They almost universally submitted, and having cleared with the law, were prepared again to abscond, and risk once more the chances of the field. But if the document was absurd, the conduct of the local authorities was not less impolitic. The removal of men, so well acquainted with the colony and its 100 retreats, was an obvious yet neglected precaution. Some were satisfied with their past experience, but others lost no time in returning to the bush. For several years the settlement suffered the utmost mischief from these bands of robbers. Among those celebrated for daring, for resolute resistance, and for frequent escapes, Michael Howe, a seaman, obtained the largest share of fame. Formerly in the Royal Navy, and afterwards owning a small coal craft, he had acquired some notion of order and command. On his arrival in Van Diemen's Land in 1812, he was assigned to Mr. Ingle, a merchant and stockholder, but he had declared that having served the king he would be no man's slave, and to cast off the yoke of such subjection was, perhaps, the main object he contemplated. Such was his pretence. Having received the benefit of the amnesty, he soon joined a gang, of which one Whitehead was the leader, among whom was a deserter of the 73rd Regiment and 2 aboriginal women. The settlers of New Norfolk they deprived of all their portable property, their arms and ammunition, and shortly after, thus equipped, they burned the wheat stacks and barns of the police magistrate, Mr. Humphrey, and those of Reardon, the district constable at Pittwater. The following month, they appeared again at New Norfolk and pillaged the residence of Mr. Carlyle, who, advising his neighbour, Mr. McCarty, of their vicinity, induced him to arm for the protection of a vessel, the Geordie, which he presumed they would endeavour to capture. McCarty and those who were with him, coming up with the robbers, demanded their arms. They were under the cover of a large hollow tree. The settlers were thus exposed to their aim. Carlyle himself received a ball in the groin and 3 slugs in the breast, and died within an hour. O'Burney, master of the vessel, was wounded by a ball in the cheek, which perforated his tongue and lodged in his neck. The banditti now commanded instant surrender, which being refused, the firing was renewed. The settlers were compelled to abandon one of their number, who was preserved by Whitehead from the violence of his comrades. When an account of this skirmish was received, armed parties were dispatched from Hobart Town and came closely on their track. They reappeared at the house of Mr. Humphrey and compelled his servants to tie the hands of each other. They then plundered whatever they found useful, destroying the rest in revenge. They had discovered handcuffs in the house. Hitherto Whitehead had been the leader, but his spite ultimately led to his destruction. He conducted his gang to the house of McCarty, into which they wantonly fired a volley of shot. A party of the 46th Regiment were lying in ambush. A brisk fire commenced, and Whitehead was mortally wounded. The darkness of the night prevented pursuit. Whitehead ran towards Howe, who, at his request, immediately cut off his head. They had bound each other thus to provide against the recognition of a fallen companion, to deprive their pursuers of the promised reward. Howe then became the leader of the band. A party of soldiers succeeded in the capture of 2 who had separated from the rest. They also recovered ammunition and firearms, of which the settlers had been pillaged. To effect the reduction of such disturbers of the public peace, martial law was proclaimed by Lieutenant Governor Davy, an exertion of power beyond his commission, and opposed by his only official adviser, the Deputy Judge Advocate. Macquarie promptly disallowed this interference with his authority. It was argued that the right to declare martial law, if vested in Davy, might be claimed by any subaltern, whose distance from the central authority gave the plea of necessity. To bring the offenders to justice at all, it was first necessary to take them. When in bonds, they would cease to be dangerous and might be forwarded to the tribunal appointed by the Crown. These arguments did not prevail to stay process. A court-martial condemned to death Maguire and Byrne, bushrangers and Stevens, a perfidious stock-keeper by whom they had been countenanced. The movements of the robbers were rapid. They plundered the residence of Mr. David Rose, near Launceston, and escaping a diligent pursuit, they reappeared at Baghdad, a distance of 100 miles. Their scouts had informed them that property to a large amount would be found there. Their confederacy was extensive, and it was asserted by Howe that some most active in his pursuit had been sharers in the profits of his crimes. The tone assumed by this robber was that of an independent chief, and in the management of his men he attempted the discipline of war. They subscribed to articles which bound them to obedience. Penalties were inflicted, such as cutting and carrying wood for their fires, or even stripes. He professed the piety of a quarterdeck and read to them the scriptures. His style and title was Governor of the Rangers, and he addressed the king's representative as Governor of the town. His taste for ceremony was once curiously exhibited. Having met a traveller, he ranged his party and called on the stranger to witness an oath, which was administered on the prayer book by one of the gang. The purport of their vow might be inferred from their message. They said they could set the whole country on fire with one stick and thrash in one night more than could be gathered in a year. Happily for mankind, the association of evil men is but transient. Howe, often absent from his party, without assigning reasons, awakened a suspicion. He retreated with a native girl, Mary, but was shortly after followed by soldiers. His companion was taken, and he lost. His dogs, his knapsack and arms, it is said that he fired at the girl because she encumbered his flight. But it was asserted by himself that he only intended to alarm and not destroy her. She became useful to the government by discovering the resort of the robbers and a flock of sheep they had stolen. At length, weary of his wandering life, Howe proposed to surrender to the government. a person who had formerly joined him in an attempt to escape in an American vessel, became the channel of communication. Howe affected to dread the violence of the settlers, who might kill him for the reward or to prevent his disclosures. But Governor Sorel sent Captain Nan to the place of meeting, with an assurance of present safety and intercession for his forgiveness. Society must have been at the verge of dissolution when letters and messages passed between the government and an outlaw. To admit its prudence requires a recollection not only of the power of the robbers, but the number of their friends. The disclosures of Howe were not important, and his companions continued still a terror to the public. Their losses were frequent, but they received continual accessions. They seized the boat, which carried provisions between Georgetown and Launceston, probably with the concurrence of the crew, several of whom joined them. They were now 20 in number, and it became necessary to unite the colony against them. The more opulent settlers were compelled to abandon their dwellings and to take refuge in the towns. Sorel, by a spirited appeal, roused their more decided efforts to destroy the marauders. Sums, subscribed by the inhabitants of Hobart Town, of 80 or 100 guineas, were offered for their apprehension. A party of military traced them to the Black Brush and thence to a settler's house at the Tea Tree, where they had dined. They had the advantage of position, but Geary, their leader, was slain, and several others wounded. The rain had damped the powder of the soldiers, which prevented their muskets from telling with full effect. But their success was ominous to the robbers. Notwithstanding the character of Howe, on the plea of ill health, he was permitted to walk abroad in charge of a constable. But whether he distrusted the promise of pardon or preferred the license of the bush, he eluded his guard and escaped, without, however, trusting his safety to the fidelity of his former companions. These soon met their fate. Hillier resolved to purchase his life by the sacrifice of his comrades. At midnight, while two of them slept, he attempted their destruction, cutting the throat of one from ear to ear and wounding the other with his own rifle. The bushrangers were now reduced to 3, Howe, Watts, and Brown. The last surrendered, but Watts conspired with a stockkeeper named Drew to seize Howe. This man, when in charge of his master's flock, occasionally corresponded with him. They accordingly met him at a place called Longbottom. Within 100 yards of each other, these old companions in crime demanded and agreed that both should knock out the priming of their guns. They then kindled a fire. Watts threw Howe on the ground, Drew tied his hands and took his knives from his pocket. They then prepared breakfast. After some delay, they proceeded to Hobart Town. Watts, with his gun, walking before Howe, and Drew behind him. The captive disengaged his hands, and with a knife he had concealed, stabbed Watts, and in an instant, seizing his gun, he shot Drew dead. Watts then expected a similar fate. He, however, reached Hobart Town and was thence forwarded to Sydney, where he died of his wounds. The Lieutenant Governor, anxious to end the career of this desperate man, offered, beside the pecuniary reward, freedom and a passage to England to any prisoner who might succeed in his capture. Stratagems were continually devised to entrap him, but he retired into the distant parts of the wood, only appearing when hunger or lack of ammunition compelled his visits. His courage and skill made him a formidable antagonist. None would venture to face him, yet so hot was the pursuit that he again left behind his knapsack and ammunition. He continued at large until the 21st October, 1818. Warburton, often an accomplice, became his betrayer. He enticed him to a hut, where he said that he would find supplies necessary for subsistence, and, notwithstanding his hesitation, which occasioned long delay, he was caught in the snare. Having discovered the ambush, he retreated with precipitation, but was overtaken and slain. Howe was charged with several murders, beside those here recorded. It was the fashion of the day to admit every rumor of his cruelty. It was stated on doubtful authority that having quarrelled with Edwards, a comrade, respecting some plunder, he slew him. That another Bowles, having discharged a pistol in sport near his person, suffered the same fate, that he tied the hands and feet of the offender and shot him dead. The death of Davenport, a stockman without much probability, was attributed to Howe. His remains were afterwards discovered, without confirming the suspicion. The relations of these men naturally led to treachery and revenge, and in the terms of their union retaliation was included. Howe kept the secret of his gang and displayed much sympathy when his companions were sick or wounded. He was a bold outlaw, prepared to maintain his freedom at whatever cost. Nor does it appear that he was wanting in those equivocal virtues which are compatible with a life of violence and guilt. His knapsack contained a record of his dreams, written on kangaroo skin with blood. He was haunted by visions of his old companions who were dead. The subject of one was his sister. He had made a list of seeds, vegetables, fruits, and even flowers intended to adorn the seclusion which he contemplated. Howe's form was athletic, his countenance strongly marked, his beard of an extraordinary length, and he was dressed in the skin of kangaroo. 5 years after his death, Howe's dwelling was found. The site was chosen with taste, in an open undulating country, stretching to the western mountains. The spot was secluded from observation, was covered with a large honeysuckle, and on a rise sloping to the stream. A gigantic tree, prostrate, which he used as a chopping block, was the boundary to which he permitted Warburton to approach. The privation, fatigue, and anxiety endured by the bushrangers they have often depicted with horror. The country, destitute of indigenous fruits or herbs, afforded no safe retreat, and they were compelled to hover round the inhabited districts to obtain ammunition even when willing to live by the chase. The increase of the settlers has long prevented protracted concealment and multiplied the chances of capture. Prompted by passion, or allured by the fascination of liberty, an unbroken succession of adventurers has sought shelter in the bush and passed through the miseries of a vagrant life. But their suppression has usually been easy, and for years the penalty of their crimes certain. In the progress of these memorials, allusions to bushrangers must occur, but the records of crime are disgusting. The Italian robber tinged his adventure with romance, the Spanish bandit was often a soldier and a partisan. But the wandering thieves of Tasmania were not less uncouth than violent, hateful for their debasement as well as terrible for their cruelty. They can rarely be objects of interest, save when points in their career illustrate principles or exhibit traits in contrast with their ordinary course. It may be proper to notice instances of courage, of constancy, or of unusual suffering. They may set forth the social state out of which they have arisen, and thus the operation of systems. But who would delight to read the dull details of wickedness which crowd the annals of this country? Footnote 1. A more singular instance occurred during the rule of Colonel Davy. A reformed bushranger was dispatched to treat with a young man who had absconded from the commissariat. He resolved to accompany the messenger into the presence of the governor, but he went armed. The kind old man received him with some rough salutation, but having discovered his pistol, he asked what was the meaning of that. In reply, he stated that he had resolved to shoot the messenger if he found treachery, a precaution which rather amused than offended the gallant commander. This statement, made by a survivor of the scene, is a curious relic of government. Jack Worrell. He was entrapped into the mutiny of the Nore, but the only part which he took in the proceedings was writing out in a fair hand several papers for the mutineers, and this he declared he did for no other purpose than to indulge his own vanity in displaying his fine writing, upon which he had highly valued himself. He was tried after the surrender of the mutineers and transported for life to Van Diemen's Land. I was now, said he, determined to make a push for the capture of this villain, Mick Howe, for which I was promised a passage to England in the next ship that sailed, and the amount of the reward laid upon his head. I found out a man of the name of Warburton, who was in the habit of hunting kangaroos for their skins, and who had frequently met Howe during his excursions and sometimes furnished him with ammunition. He gave me such an account of Howe's habits that I felt convinced we could take him with a little assistance. I therefore spoke to a man of the name of Pugh, belonging to the 48th Regiment, one whom I knew was a most cool and resolute fellow. He immediately entered into my views, and having applied to Major Bell, his commanding officer, he was recommended by him to the governor, by whom I was permitted to act, and allowed to join us. So he and I went directly to Warburton, who heartily entered into the scheme, and all things were arranged for putting it into execution. The plan was thus: Pugh and I were to remain in Warburton's hut, while Warburton himself was to fall into Howe's way. The hut was on the River Shannon, standing so completely by itself and so out of the track of anybody who might be feared by Howe that there was every probability of accomplishing our wishes and scotch the snake, as they say, if not kill it. Pugh and I accordingly proceeded to the appointed hut. We arrived there before daybreak, and having made a hearty breakfast, Warburton set out to seek Howe. He took no arms with him, in order to still more effectually carry his point, but Pugh and I were provided with muskets and pistols. The sun had been just an hour up when we saw Warburton and Howe upon the top of a hill coming towards the hut. We expected they would be with us in a quarter of an hour, and so we sat down upon the trunk of a tree inside the hut, calmly waiting their arrival. An hour passed, but they did not come, so I crept to the door cautiously and peeped out. There I saw them standing within 100 yards of us, in earnest conversation. As I learned afterwards, the delay arose from Howe's suspecting that all was not right. I drew back from the door to my station, and in about 10 minutes after this, we plainly heard footsteps, and the voice of Warburton. Another moment, and Howe slowly entered the hut, his gun presented and cocked. The instant he espied us, he cried out, "Is that your game?" and immediately fired, but Pugh's activity prevented the shot from taking effect, for he knocked the gun aside. Howe ran off like a wolf. I fired but missed. Pugh then halted and took aim at him, but also missed. I immediately flung away the gun and ran after Howe. Pugh also pursued. Warburton was a considerable distance away. I ran very fast, so did Howe, and if he had not fallen down an unexpected bank, I should not have been fleet enough for him. This fall, however, brought me up with him. He was on his legs and preparing to climb a broken bank, which would have given him a free run into the wood, when I presented my pistol at him and desired him to stand. He drew forth another, but did not level it at me. We were about 15 yards from each other, the bank he fell from between us. He stared at me with astonishment, and to tell you the truth, I was a little astonished at him, for he was covered with patches of kangaroo skins and wore a black beard, a haversack and powder horn slung across his shoulders. I wore my beard also, as I do now, and a curious pair we looked like. After a moment's pause, he cried out, "Black beard against grey beard for 1,000,000, and fired. I slapped at him, and I believe hit him, for he staggered, but rallied again, and was clearing the bank between him and me, when Pugh ran up, and with the butt end of his firelock knocked him down again, jumped after him, and battered his brains out just as he was opening a clasp knife to defend himself. The Military Sketchbook. End of Chapter 57, being Transportation. Section 6.